Hello and welcome or welcome back. This month I'm talking about adaptations of books into movies or TV show formats, and in this video I'm going to be talking about when adaptations change the ending. Now when I say they changed the ending, I don't mean, oh, everything is the same except there's this one detail that's different. What I mean is, like, it was a tragedy but they gave it a happy ending, or it had a love triangle and they changed which couple ended up together, or it was a murder mystery and they changed the answer to who did it. Things like that. Originally, I got the idea for this video from Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, which has been adapted many times and rarely keeps the original ending. Even in the stage play adapted from the novel, and the play was written by Agatha Christie herself, it has a different ending. The killer is usually, but not always, kept the same, but one of the biggest changes is having two characters be innocent and survive, which is totally different from the original novel, where all the characters except the current murderer are guilty of the past crimes that the murderer accuses them of, and none of them make it off the island alive. The interesting thing about having the last two victims actually be innocent of the crimes that they're accused of and end up surviving is that in the novel they're the ones that are guilty of the worst crimes. The murderer specifically says when it's all revealed what happened that he was going from the people he views as least guilty to the people he views as most guilty. Now, I can actually make a case for why Vera Claythorne being innocent is an acceptable alternate ending, because while the novel makes it very, very clear that she is guilty, that's not obvious throughout the story. The explanation that she provides does sound believable, so it's somewhat questionable early on whether she really did it or whether she was really trying to save the kid or how exactly it played out. It's not until flashbacks show in detail how it played out that it becomes really clear that no, she really is just a terrible person. And she's also the last one to die, so I can see why if you want someone to be innocent and survive, she would be a logical choice. On the other hand, Philip Lombard, really? I mean, he just openly admits from the start that he did it. And what he did was pretty terrible. Anyway, that's all a tangent, but what I wanted to say is that it's very common for this story to have characters being innocent and characters surviving, whereas in the book, they were all guilty and they all died. And Then There Were None is not the only one of Agatha Christie's works to get an alternate ending in an adaptation. Others also had different endings in the original work versus the stage play. And the 2018 TV series based on Ordeal by Innocence completely changed the answer as far as who did it. So that got me thinking about other works where the ending is changed. And that could be anything from The Wizard of Oz, where it turns out to all just be a dream in the movie, but in the book it was definitely real and she goes back multiple times in the sequels, to something like Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which turns the novel's tragic ending into a happy one. And that got me thinking about why these changes might be made. I'm not really here today to discuss whether they were good changes or not. I think in some cases they probably were, in some cases they definitely weren't, and in some cases they probably were necessary. Sometimes it's necessary, for instance, if the story is being adapted for kids, but the original ending is very much not kid-friendly. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a good example of that. The novel is not for kids. It's not appropriate for kids. It wasn't written for kids. Most kids of the age that the movie was targeted towards wouldn't even be able to read it because just the reading level would be too high. But in turning it into a kids' animated movie, there was no way to keep the original ending. It would have been way too dark, way too tragic, wouldn't have appealed to the target audience. And so it changes to a happy ending. Now, my question there, and I talked about this when I made the video about The Hunchback of Notre Dame, my question is why on earth adapt that story for kids at all? But I do get that if they were going to do that, it would make sense to give it a different ending. Even if not a child-friendly adaptation, sometimes the original ending can just be too dark or unpleasant, and Then There Were None is a good example of that. The novel is very dark. There are no sympathetic characters, there's nobody that the reader is meant to care about, and so you're just watching all these terrible people get killed off one by one and trying to figure out who's doing it. It's not a story where you're really meant to sympathize with or identify with any of the characters. But audiences often like to have a protagonist that they can root for, and the only way to do that with that story is to make one or more of the characters innocent. Adaptations of Shakespeare's tragedies sometimes tend to fall into this category as well. For example, West Side Story clearly takes a ton of inspiration from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. However, unlike the original play, it ends with one of the two main characters still alive. The young adult novel Ophelia and the 2018 movie by the same name, which is an adaptation of the book, both take a similar route with the story of Hamlet. Ophelia is cast as the main character, and her descent into madness and eventual death are faked, so she ends up surviving the story. The implication is that you just don't know that in the play because Hamlet never found out. In order to turn the tragedy into a not kid-friendly but teenager-friendly young adult story, it was necessary, I think, to have the protagonist survive. Sometimes an ending can be difficult to do on screen. Like, for instance, with And Then There Were None, there's an explanation about what happened, but it's all after the fact, through the character who committed the murders, who wrote down what they did and why and everything, and the message was found later after everybody was dead. But because literally nobody survived, there's no character to tell that story. You can't play it out through action or dialogue or whatever. In the book, it's just there's this thing that says what happened. Sometimes the ending in the original story can be very ambiguous. Like, for instance, the original ending of The Giver ends with Jonas going downhill on a sled towards what seems like a village with lights. It's really left ambiguous as to whether that's a memory, like the memories that were transmitted from The Giver, whether that is his, hallucinations as he freezes to death, or whether he's really on his way to a village that's not his own community. There's also absolutely no indication as to what happened back in his own community after he left. However, the sequels do give more information on that. In The Messenger, it's implied that the leader of the community that the new protagonist is living in is in fact Jonas from The Giver, and that's made explicitly clear in the fourth novel, Son, where we're also told that things in the community changed after Jonas left. So while the Giver movie does make a lot of changes, in some ways the ending being changed keeps it consistent with the rest of the series. However, it does sacrifice the ambiguity of the original. Sometimes changing the ending in a mystery story can also keep an element of suspense, because if someone has read the original novel, then they'll know who did it. In addition to the examples from Agatha Christie that I mentioned, another adaptation that does this is the TV series Elementary, which is based on the Sherlock Holmes stories. Towards the end of season 1, we meet the character of Irene Adler, and having read any work by Sherlock Holmes, you think you know who Irene Adler is. You think you know who she is to Holmes, what kind of role she's going to play in the story. Yes, they do her a bit differently in various adaptations, often overemphasizing the romance or making her more of an outright criminal than she was in the original. But ultimately, you think you know who this character is. And then they pull the rug out from under you because, spoiler alert, she's Moriarty. It just makes it this shocking twist that probably knowing the original stories makes you less likely to guess it. And then finally, sometimes changing the ending can be the entire premise of the story. An example of that is the TV show Once Upon a Time, which the basic premise of it is that instead of their happy endings, a bunch of fairy tale characters ended up under a curse, living in a small town in Maine with no idea who they are. And so if characters like Snow White and Cinderella and so on and so forth had lived happily ever after, the story wouldn't exist. And then because of that premise of, they're all under a curse in Maine, when they do eventually get their happy endings, it often looks a little bit different from how it would have if all of that had never happened. So basically the conclusion that I've come to is that there can be all kinds of reasons to change the ending in an adaptation. It can be done to make the story more kid-friendly or just more palatable in general. It can be done because things that worked well in the book might not work well on screen. If sequels clarified something that was left ambiguous in the first novel, it can make it consistent with that. It can increase the mystery or suspense of a story that involves plot twists if they play out differently in the adaptation. It can just be the basic premise of the story, like this is what happened instead of the original ending. And sometimes I just don't know what to make of it. Why was it so important that it was all just a dream in The Wizard of Oz when it clearly wasn't in the book? Or why in The Lost World, the second Jurassic Park movie, is there a T-Rex running around a city when that was nowhere in the book? As far as my personal thoughts on this, I think sometimes it can be done well, often it's done badly. It's the sort of thing where I can understand that there's sometimes a reason for it, but I often don't like it. But as I've said before in other videos, I don't believe that the only thing important about an adaptation is that it stay as close as possible to the story. So I would say there definitely are cases where it would be necessary, or even very desirable, to change the ending. And there are also cases in which it's a very bad decision, but they do it anyway. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this. If you liked it and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos on Mondays and Thursdays.